Hello, folks. Welcome back to World War II TV and the last show of this week. Lots more content coming next week. But in 1945, along with liberation and the end of conflict, it also saw the continuation of the very complicated process of attempting to get justice for the victims of atrocities. Romania began its war crimes trials 80 years ago this month, and we have assembled a panel of guests to discuss this, led by World War II TV regular Grant. I'll bring him in and everyone else in now. Good afternoon, evening, folks. How are everybody today?
Great.
Hello. Hi.
Hi.
Doing well.
Good. So, Grant, introduce us to our venerable panel of distinguished historians, please.
Yeah, to begin with, Diana Dumitru is the visiting Ion Ratsu Professor of Romanian Studies at Georgetown University. She's in the Washington, D.C. area near me. She's also originally from the Republic of Moldova and has skills both in Romanian and Russian, which is really useful in her research. Her first book was The State, Anti-Semitism, and Collaboration in the Holocaust, which looked at the civilian participation of mass murder in the borderlands of Romania and the Soviet Union during World War II. Her latest book, Soviet Jews Under Late Stalinism, is forthcoming from Cambridge University Press. She also serves on many editorial boards, including for the Journal of Genocide Research, Holocaust and Genocide Studies, and East European Jewish Affairs. Ștefan Cristian Ionescu is currently the Leon and Sophie Weinstein Associate Professor in Holocaust History and Associate Director of the Rogers Center of the Holocaust Education at Chapman University in California. So he's actually up the road from where I grew up. He's originally from Romania. His first book, Jewish Resistance to Romanianization, 1944, examined the Romanian version of Aryanization, expropriating property from Jews and how they responded and resisted to these efforts. He has a newly released book, really fascinating, I'm just beginning to read, called Justice and Restitution in Post-Nazi Romania, Rebuilding Jewish Lives and Communities, 1944 to 1950, focusing on this transitional period after the war. Emanuel Marius Grec is a PhD candidate in history at the University of Heidelberg. He's also from Romania. Currently, he's a doctoral fellow at the Fondation pour la Mémoire de la Shoah in Paris. He will start a fellowship at the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum this fall, and currently working on his dissertation entitled The Perpetrators of the Odessa Massacre, War Crimes Trials in Post-War Romania, 1944 to 1948. He also recently published I'm Ashamed to Be Sad, Mihail Sebastian's Journal, as Lived History. This is an examination of a famous Romanian Jewish writer's diary from the 1930s and during World War II. Finally, myself, I'm a historian with the U.S. Army Center of Military History, which means I need to say what I'm saying here are my own opinions and don't represent that of the U.S. government or Army or Department of Defense. I served a Morin mission in Romania for 2 years, so that's how I come into this. I'm neither Romanian nor Moldovan, but I love both very much, and I've visited both countries. My book, Romania's Holy War, Soldiers' Motivation in the Holocaust, came out a couple years ago. I've also done an Osprey volume that just came out last year on Romania in 1944. And finally, I want to point out we are all members of the Society for Romanian Studies, and specifically its Holocaust and Second World War Working Group. So we're here, which Diana and I actually co-convene, and so we're kind of representing this body of Romanianists who work from all over. I mean, Ştefan in California, Emanuel in Romania and Europe. We have Israelis, all kinds of people in this working group, and in the Romanian Studies Society for Romanian Studies in general, we have a very wide ranging group of people studying all sorts of things in Romania. So be sure to check out, what we do, and maybe if you're interested, we have a journal and other things that go on. With that, I think we're wrapped up with introductions.
Great. So Grant, folks, I'm letting Grant do a lot of the heavy lifting today because he has the expertise to share this, and particularly to move it along. I will be kind of putting questions from you guys to the panel as we go along, but we're going to hand over to the four panelists to kind of take us through this bit by bit, the people who are on trial, the situation before and ahead. So Grant, kick us off.
So just to set the stage a little, is there one slide before this, or is this the first slide? I can't remember.
It's just the title. Oh no, hang on, there was that one. Yeah,
so
yeah.
I think there's one more before this.
There we go. Sorry, my mistake.
So I just want to set the stage a little bit. I mean, we are pretty much 80 years tomorrow out from what we're going to be discussing, the indictments of these war criminals. But we have VE Day approaching. You're getting news of Hitler. There's 172,000 Romanian soldiers in the front fighting in Slovakia, and actually they're currently crossing the border into the Czech protectorate. They're actually going to end up pretty close to Prague before they end their fighting. But at all the same time, back home in Romania, which is now under Soviet occupation, there is this war crimes trial, the first war crimes trial in Romania about Romanian war criminals. So with that, I want to kind of set up and just have us discuss why these war crimes trials are taking place. So I'll start off with and let everyone else interject as they want. But I mean, number one of the reasons why this is happening is because of an armistice signed in September of 1944, soon after a political change in Romania. Article 14 of the Soviet-Romanian armistice says the Romanian government and High Command undertake to collaborate with the Allied Soviet High Command in the apprehension and trial of persons accused of war crimes. And that's kind of one of the main, kind of instigating all the reason for this war crimes trial. Ştefan, I don't know if you want to kind of go in a little bit about kind of what legal things had to happen for this to get set up from that armistice agreement to this point where we're actually having the trial.
Yes, I can say a few things. So the armistice agreement was crucial to set up the framework, the legal framework to organize these trials, because for the post-Antonescu Romanian government, this was an international legal obligation they assumed through this agreement, especially because they were hoping to get a really good deal during the next peace negotiations for the final peace treaty. So the peace negotiations took place later in 1945, especially 1946, and the peace treaty was signed eventually by Romania with the Allies in February 1947. So this was kind of the target, to fulfill diligently the obligations in the armistice agreement and kind of to obtain a good deal from the Allies. So after collapse of Antonescu, Romania was ruled by several transitional governments. This is important, made by parties from the coalition of parties that organized a putsch against Antonescu, that removed Antonescu in August 1944. So these were four main parties, like the National Liberal Party, National Peasant Party, Social Democratic Party, and the Communist Party. And of course, the monarchy, the king, also had a role in this putsch, and he also kind of promoted people in this government. So the first governments were were headed by generals. First, General Constantin Sănătescu, who was the head of the two governments in the fall 1944, and later on General Nicolae Rădescu, who was the head of the government until late February. And in March 1945, we have a major change of governments, and also like major, I would say, turning point in Romania's future, because we have the Petru Groza government coming to power. This is a pro-communist government. It's like coalition of leftist, radical leftist parties, kind of organized by the Communist Party and the Soviet. It aimed to kind of emulate one of these Popular Front coalitions. So they come to power in early March 1945, and among different things, they start to adopt kind of different radical measures. I mean, not too radical. One of them is like expropriation of land and distribution to peasants, like potential voters. But also they organize pretty quickly this trial. So the first trial that we are going to talk about today starts in May, on 3rd of May 1945, and it has an important role, political and social role, together with the next trials. I can talk more about that later.
Yeah, I think one thing that's interesting as I was reading your book, there's kind of the categories of war profiteers, war criminals, and those guilty of the country's disaster. And I wonder, maybe Diana, do you want to talk a little bit, kind of rewind a little bit, talk about what those kind of things are?
Maybe I'll start by highlighting the fact that, of course, the Soviets were the ones who were present in Romania. So hence this role highlighted, in the document that Grant cited. But also it's very important to keep in mind that most of the crimes that were put on trial in May 1945 were actually committed on the Soviet territory. And Transnistria, that was administered by Ionescu's regime, is the territory of nowadays Ukraine, so the regions of Nikolaev, Odessa, and Vinnytsia. Therefore, it was in addition to just like being an ally that controlled the territory, I think was a direct interest because of this specific tie to the region and between Romania and the Soviet Union. So yeah, the types of people who were in this so-called lot, there were high-ranking militaries, and there were administrators in Transnistria, for example, and like one individual that I can talk more about is Modesti Sopescu, who was the prefect, the administrative position of the county of Golta, which is in Transnistria. And importantly, I think like one of the key accusations against him was for a crime that's probably this is the single biggest crime committed by the Antonescu authorities during World War II in Bogdanovka, where over 45,000 Jews were massacred and burned in the site of Bogdanovka. So Modest Isopescu was like specifically put on trial for this crime, but also other crimes that were committed under the third photograph here, you see that's his photograph. But there were others, like smaller, also officers, gendarmes from the Romanian army. And among them were also two Jewish prisoners, actually, the ones who were co-opted by the administration of camps, including camp in Bogdanovka, one camp in Vapnearka, to help especially spoliate the prisoners. So if I can speak a little bit about the case of Modesti Sopescu, which is a very interesting one, and how he behaved and how he tried to deflect the accusation against him personally, because as I mentioned, it was the one like biggest crime committed, even like bigger numbers compared to the city of Odessa, which was a very known and highly publicized atrocity. Isopescu really tried a number of strategies, but like his first strategy was to say that the Germans did it, because the location of this town, Bogdanovka, it was right on the river Bug, which was dividing the territory under the control of Romanians and territory under the control of Germans. So he tried the line that Germans did it, although like technically it would have been impossible because it was under his administrative power. So then he tried another thing. He said, actually 7-8 days before the massacre, he got sick and he was ridden to bed and he didn't know about the massacre. He said that actually he learned from his deputy, and that his deputy also, sounds like a joke, that his deputy learned about the massacre from rumors. And then the last line of defense was, well, if you do find that actually the gendarmes under his control participated to this massacre, probably they didn't ask for permission. It's that they went there without his permission. So all this attempts to try, and was the ultimate real line of defense was that it was typhus. The extraordinary measures were needed. So what is the solution to a catastrophe that is epidemical? The mass killing. And Germans did it. And we did not know anything. And also even his lawyer included in his petition saying, at the time, we're very weak and modest compared to Germans. So the Germans did it, not us. But of course, he wasn't proved, and there were almost 200 witnesses, some of them survivors, some of them employees, some of their gendarmes, and they all basically told the same story, that even one of the preparation meeting took place in house of Modesti Sopescu. So he was sentenced to death, but as any other people who were on trial and were sentenced to death, the death was commuted to.
Well, let's wait for this. Let's wait for the sentences, because I want to back up just because there's a question here as well.
We'll talk about what happened after.
And I want to turn this over to Marius for, because there was a question here about, how many people, were they all in attendance? As I kind of pointed out in that slide, we have, some 46 different defendants. A number of them, I think, and I'll turn this over to Emanuel kind of to talk about how this is done. That first picture, if you go back one slide, I want to thank Emanuel for providing, he found this. And it shows a portion. Not all of the people we're going to talk about, has several of the ones we're going to focus on. But he can kind of talk about how maybe some of the logistics of bringing these guys in, how many were actually there, and how they kind of address this.
Right. Thanks, Grant. And this is important, especially regarding if we're talking about this trial, like you mentioned, it's the first, right? So this trial begins, I think, in 3rd of May. But a month before is actually the first time that we have the legislation, the final kind of the most important legislation to get these guys, which is agreement number 212/1945, which basically states all the accusations. You have different levels of accusations. You have war crimes. You can have crimes against peace, starting the war against the Soviet Union, and importantly, the accusation of fascist propaganda, which is not present in any other context in that time, right? So this is in April 1945. Less than a month later, in the beginning of May, this trial starts. So this is kind of the trial that sets the stage for all the other trials. It's also a public trial. Not all of them were. In up until 1948, it depended. The press was very interested in Macici. He actually says this in the trial at some point. Accusing the press that they wanted to smear his name and so on. The picture that you have here is part of the so-called jury, right? Which is from the trial. There are very few pictures actually from the trial, though it was a public trial. This is from Scânteia, from the official communist newspaper, which was, remember, this is 45. The communist regime was still not established yet. Scânteia had this role of trying to talk more and more, try to talk a lot about these trials, how guilty these people were, how they were different from the Romanian people in general, and so on. So in terms of logistics, this trial happens very fast after the special law is adopted in April. There were several laws before that. They tried to, right at the beginning of 1945, they tried to establish some sort of post-war trials through law number 50 and 51, if I'm not mistaken. That didn't pan out. Then Groza, like you mentioned, Grant, comes in March. And in April, because the pro-communist government was very adamant about bringing these guys to justice, you have the law in April, and then this trial in May. Also, importantly, because this trial is like the first one of the 16 group trials, if I remember correctly, that took place, it kind of set the stage. And some of the people who were accused or who were indicted in some of these first trials, like Macici or the second one, the third one, and who were in absentia, the law said that basically these guys were were found guilty with the maximum penalty immediately. If you're indicted and not there physically, you were automatically given the harsher sentence. However, some of these people were either caught or turned themselves in which case, if they asked for another trial, they would get one. That's why you get some of the people who are in the Macici trial and the other group trials who are on the indictment, you find them tried in later trials because they asked for it. And some of them actually get away. So not all of them are convicted. Various reasons, right? So the picture that you see here is exactly naming Generals Tresteoreanu, Calotescu, and Zlătescu, and Stere Marinescu as accused in these trials. I want to, if you can put the next picture that you had, this one, right? So here, right, we have Macici, which is the first one to the left with the eye, right? And then you have Tresteoreanu and Isopescu and Stere Marinescu, right? Importantly, the first two are accused specifically of crimes from the Odessa massacre. Not only, but especially Macici, who also later was moved, whatever, but most of them, the two of them are accused for the Odessa massacre, specifically. Odessa massacre accusations happen also in other trials. only in this one, but this is very important because this Macici trial gets its name from Macici, not because Macici was more important than the others, but because he was a symbol. He was the symbol of the Odessa massacre, for which others also had blame, including Traistoreanu, Antonescu, and others. But Macici was symbolic. So you have other lots, right, which have different names, but this one is emblematic for Macici and discusses the Odessa massacre, discusses Bogdanovka, it discusses a bunch of other crimes that all take place, like Diana said.
And I think that's a good point to transition to Ştefan, because you can introduce this last person, kind of talking about this idea of deportation of Jews from parts of Romania, and also maybe address the question that someone had, which we should have brought up, is who is doing this? Are the Soviets doing this, or the Romanians?
Yeah, I was going to jump in and say that before we bring Ştefan in, because Grant, you kind of explained about the situation of the various factions that are involved in Romania. Because how would we describe the government? Is it like a coalition at this point? Is that like a good word to describe it? Is it a temporary government? Is it a war? Is it a military government? I mean, I know language gets very complicated, and especially in 1945 when everything is kind of in flux. It's processing from one set of rules to another, but is Romania a state at this point? Is it a coalition? How would you describe it to any people like myself who knows nothing, Grant?
Well, that's one of the interesting things about the turning of arms is that there's a continuity of the state, because you had the king carry out this coup in 23rd of August 1944. You end the dictatorship, and you have the state kind of continues to function. He takes over all the powers. In some ways, you actually almost have a continuation of a military dictatorship. Right. Because you have Ionescu, who is a military officer, made prime minister. The king has more power than he did before. But they also bring in some of the historic parties and also the Communist Party. So there's this attempt to kind of have a veneer of democracy. Then, as Ştefan pointed out, by March, these kind of military royalist governments have been sapped and pushed around by the Soviet the Soviet occupiers and this resurgent Romanian Communist Party and these other leftist parties, whether there's Social Democrats or the Plowman's Front. And so, and all that I'll turn this over to Ştefan. I think he might be able to address this better. Is that it is a coalition government at this point, but one where the communists control the key, ministries, but it's not a communist government yet.
And these are not Soviet trials. That's important to say.
They're
Romanian trials. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. So, yeah, Ştefan.
Yes, absolutely. So I would say that, maybe a few things about the court. So this is a People's Tribunal, Tribunalul Poporului. It's a special court. It's an ad hoc tribunal. So it's not part of the regular system of local judicial courts. And this is one of the criticism. It was established through the law mentioned earlier by Emanuel, this law from 312 from April 1945, that established this court. And also this court had two branches. So it's important. One, I would say the main one was based in Bucharest that tried, most of the most important representatives of the Antonescu regime and its collaborators. The other one was based in Cluj, Cluj-Napoca city in Transylvania. Most of those who were indicted and tried in that branch are those who were involved in the administration of northern Transylvania by Hungary during the war and by the German administration towards the end, and also mass deportation of northern Transylvanian Jews to Auschwitz. So there are two main courts. It seemed to be that the one in Bucharest was the main one, although in terms of verdicts, we can talk later on, the one in Cluj was harsher.
And if you want to kind of introduce that fourth person on that slide.
Yes,
and
absolutely.
Introduce the idea of this other, because we talked about Odessa massacre, we talked about the Bogdanovka massacre. We'll get into some more detail. But then this person kind of represents one of the last kind of major war crimes we'll be talking about.
Yes, so who was this Nicolae, who was maybe not so well known as the other? He was not a general, he was a colonel at that time. He was a major during the war when he was involved in the crimes against Jews. In fact, he was a career military officer, and during the war between late 1941 and 1943, he was based in Czernowitz, in Bukovina, the famous city of Czernowitz, and he was the head of the military cabinet of the Governor General Corneliu Calotescu, and also kind of the head of the second bureau, who was also in charge with the Jews, so the Jewish affairs. And the main crimes that Ionescu is indicted for. So he's indicted for the deportation, managing the deportation of Jews from Czernowitz, especially, I mean, the second wave of deportation. The first one took place in fall 1941. He was in charge of the second wave of deportation of Jews from Czernowitz to Transnistria that took place in summer of 1942. He's also accused of blackmailing local Jews, extorting them, acquiring different Jewish property, so and also hitting a Jewish woman, a mother, behaving cruelly, but he's not accused of specifically participating directly as a murderer. So he's one of what I would call like a desk perpetrator, kind of resembling maybe somehow in the case of more well-known case of Adolf Eichmann, like the Nazi desk perpetrator who was in charge as the manager of deportation. And he's also kind of very sly figure. I mean, he's kind of related to what Diana mentioned earlier. He's trying to defend himself by denying that he took part in this, denying that he had any responsibility in decision-making process. So he blamed his superiors like Antonescu in Bucharest, the dictator, and General Călătescu, the governor of Bucovina. But he also denied having any role in the implementation of this deportation or violence against Jews or dispossession. So he blamed like the local agents of deportation, like let's say rank-and-file soldiers, gendarmes, and policemen. But he was sentenced also to death, and then we'll talk a little bit about that. Maybe I just want to add a few things about, this trial. So it was mentioned earlier, there are two main accusations: war crimes, like the typical war crimes, killing, torturing, rape, and the second one was crime of disaster against the country, planning this disaster of the country. And this is more problematic. It's kind of a new type of crime, like vaguer, kind of more vague, more flexible, that allowed the court and kind of the government to indict faster and maybe to harsher roles people who've been involved in those who had position of power, political power during the Antonescu regime, and who are involved in this decision of, cooperating with the Germans. So basically bringing the Germans in the country somehow, one way or another. And those who made like different types of propaganda or supported this decision. So it was very flexible, could indict a lot of people under this. But in this specific crime, the first crime trial, that Macici case that we are discussing today, mostly what was used was the war crime accusation. So that's why I would say that, this reflects more like the deeds of this perpetrators, what they did on the ground. So less the broader accusation of treason, like collaboration with Germany or betraying the country or other types of things. So it's a more practical accusations.
I think I want to take a minute right here just to point out this map. I think this will help the audience, right? There's kind of like three areas that are associated with these crimes. So you kind of have the pink there of most of Romania. There's kind of relatively limited. There's a big pogrom in Iași. This all really gets started in 1941. But then you have deportations, those kind of darker green areas, and you have Bucovina and Bessarabia. These are parts of it are reconquered, and the Jews who are then come back into Romanian control are going to be deported, many of them murdered on the spot. And they're also going to be Jews from Bucovina who never were under Soviet occupation from 1940-41, who will also be deported. And where they deported to is that kind of weird turd color, maybe it's appropriate, Transnistria. This is part of Ukraine that was annexed by the Romanians and administered by the Romanians. Well, not annexed. It was not technically annexed, but it was basically run as a Romanian state. They have occupation authority. They have some carve-outs for the Germans. And one thing I want to point out is that these crimes, while they do focus, as Diana said, on crimes against Soviet citizens and in Soviet areas like Transnistria, they don't really cover, and we still don't really cover, the crimes by Romanians beyond this map into the rest of southern Ukraine, Crimea, especially where they helped conquer and occupy for 2 years, all the way into southern Russia. There are war crimes. These kind of get sucked into the Soviet war crimes trials, and often the Romanians kind of fall out as the Germans become the perpetrators and the Romanians get lesser. But so these war crimes trials we're looking at are mostly focused on what's happening on Romanian territory in these liberated, or, in quotation mark, areas of Bessarabia, Bucovina, and then Transnistria.
Can I say a couple of words, I think, like about the social environment around the trial, and also so the people better understand that the lawyers, the judges, people who were affiliated to the trial, there were a part of them were like definitely just professionals who used to do the job before 45 and also in the interwar era. Some of them were kind of newly recruited for the purpose, I think like less than half probably, and were viewed as like leftist sympathizers or something like this. At the same time, what is very clear from the documentation of the trial is that while some were striving to adopt the language that would like speak about this like anti-fascist, crimes, and at the same time, the legacy of pre-war era to me seemed like heavier than this like new element of like Sovietness, at least at the time in the documentation, because there were a lot of protests against the unconstitutionality of the law, that the law is like, it's an ad hoc law, that like this is not, the court doesn't have the right. So it was a lot of technicality that you wouldn't see later in the socialist bloc or earlier inside the Soviet Union. So, and also if even you step outside the court itself and you look what's happening around, and we know, and Ştefan knows like from even diaries and documentation of the era, it was a clear understanding that the majority of society did not want a harsh punishment for these people because it was like they were viewed as their soldiers, some of them known as war heroes, and like suddenly is this like turn of events, and there is a court that is asking a harsh punishment, and it was like not a social support for this kind of harsh punishment at the time.
Yep. So Grant, I think I want to kind of pose the question. It seems to me that this is being organized fairly hastily, partly because of there's an idea of getting this punishment out quickly because it's fresh in people's minds, even though these events go back to 41.
Because it had to be done, because it was demanded from the outside, and because they knew they had to sign a peace treaty, and it was like point as a peace treaty, it was no choice than to do this. I
think also Ştefan has something interesting in his book. He points out, if you look at the idea in a society that's very anti-Semitic, even after you've now been occupied by the Soviets, maybe especially since you've been occupied by the Soviets, and you're looking towards a future peace treaty that you think it's going to be like World War I in Paris, and you're going to have the Allies. So if you're an anti-Semite, what do you believe? And I can toss this off to Ştefan. What do you think about the Allies, both Soviet and Western?
Yeah, I mean, for sure, anti-Semitism did not disappear in Romanian society with the collapse of Ionescu regime. I mean, of course, it would have been impossible to disappear. But I think what's important in a way to understand these trials is that, again, most people in society were rather anti-Semitic or didn't like the Jews, at least saying so. There are a lot of people who profited directly from the Ionescu regime and the persecution of Jews one way or another through a property, a house, a job, or valuables. But there is also like a period of uncertainty and kind of like in a way, a lot of uncertainty about the political future of the country. Many people fear that this kind of Soviet liberation or occupation, depends how it was framed at that time in different ways, it might become permanent, so it might lead to, but others have hope that Western allies perhaps would intervene and would allow Romanians like independent elections. Eventually the elections took place in late 1946 in the fall, and were basically falsified by the communist regime. But I would say that it's important, this kind of uncertainty about the political future of the country. It's important also in the procedural things in the trial, in the case, because it seemed to me that a lot of judges, prosecutors, or like policemen and others were not yet sure what will be the final political future of the country. So the thing is that the communist regime who organized these trials hastily, this is very important, they did not yet control completely the country institutions like the judiciary, the judges, the prosecutors, the lawyers, and even though some of those were communist sympathizers or like radical leftists, they did not behave as the Communist Party expected, or the Soviets. So in the end, I mean, to anticipate a little bit, I mean, both the communist regime, I mean, Romania Communist Party and communist officials and the Soviets were very unhappy with the results of the trials of People's Tribunal, of all these trials. So basically, the People's Tribunal, I think we forgot to mention that, it functioned for a very short period of time. So in 1946 was dismantled, the People's Tribunal. So it functioned for a year and something, so less than 2 years. And of course, war crime trials continue later on, organized by the appeals courts and the military tribunals later on, especially another legislation was adopted in 1947. But even the communist regime were unhappy in the end with the results of the tribunal trial. And this, I think it's important because it contradicts the widespread sentiment at that time. But even today, I would say, in Romania, to a considerable extent, that among the population that see these trials as like fake trials, like show case trial, like Soviet show trials, Stalinist trials imposed completely and run completely by the Soviet occupations. And so they're not like accurate and completely unreliable. And I think if we look carefully at the proceeding of these trials, it seemed clear that these were like real trial, genuine trial that used a lot of evidence. I mean, they look a lot of procedure, respected the rule of law at that time. People had lawyers, a lot of evidence was presented. The defendant had the right to reject the accusation. So so basically, it's also important. Most of the defendants, they rejected the accusations, or they tried to downplay their role. So they did not confess as in a typical show trial or in later on Romanian falsified trial. So most of them did not confess the guilt. It seems to me that at least like in the first trial, they are not torture physically. I mean, there's been some pressure psychologically, and a lot of the investigation for this first trial took place in fall, early winter, and early spring. So even before, most of it took place before the communist regime came to power, this communist coalition.
Mm-hmm.
Well, yeah, and I think it's important to say on what Ştefan mentioned is that also the numbers or the idea how the trials work speaks for itself, because if you look in Europe, even in Central and Eastern Europe, the numbers of the people's tribunals, and even afterwards, after they were dismantled, the numbers of those that were convicted are minimal. I mean, compared to if you look at Hungary, for example, or in the Soviet Union, I don't even want to talk about how many people were convicted and so on. In Romania, like in these people's tribunals, the total number of people who are investigated is less than 3,000. In a country that had hundreds of thousands of soldiers, right? Tens of thousands of soldiers who could have been put on trials, nothing like that. I mean, the Bucharest People Tribunal convicted somewhere under 200 people, and only 4 were executed, right? Mm-hmm. So, and those were the only ones who were actually executed. So the numbers themselves, like I completely agree with what Diana and Ștefan said. First of all, the legislation on these trials is not completely Soviet-inspired, maybe not even a majority Soviet-inspired, because it has a continuation of what was before. You needed the professionalization. In order to carry out these trials, you needed professionals. Not everybody could be, I don't know, somebody who's completely unprepared for the job. And this was important. I mean, the president of the Macici trial was Ilie Țabrea, who worked for the Antonescu regime. Alexandru Voitonovici, I think, who was also the member of the jury, also worked for the Antonescu regime. So not all of them were like, new people as the propaganda wanted to show. And secondly, and this is important to what Ștefan said, I would argue even further that these were not show trials in any case. They let a lot of people off in terms of guilt, because while the law was, disaster of the country and all that was a very broad thing to say. However, evidence was important. If you didn't have evidence, you couldn't convict people. But and that's why a lot of people were not brought
Yeah,
the court.
exactly. I totally agree with what you say. I'd say that we do know from documentation that actually it's not that there were empathy and I don't know, feelings of being now the victim. The victimhood was appearing on the side of the Romanians and the ones who were in the army, and this kind of collegiality. So we know that there were cases when some superior officers would tip off others when they learn about the arrest mandate, and others would go into hiding, which is a case I know very well because it was a massacre in a village in Pepeni and nowadays Moldova. For example, in that one village, just to draw the parallel about what it means, Soviet type of punishment. In that one village where about 300 Jews were killed, the Soviets came back and they put on trial over 30 people, locals, collaborators, that worked together with 3 gendarmes, Romanian gendarmes, who managed to flee to Romania. Out of them, 6 received death sentences and 2 were commuted, but 4 were executed. So that you understand, it's just one village, and in whole Romania, you have 4 people executed. So it's if we're talking about Soviet type of show trials, war trials, this is what it is. It's much harsher, much more extensive. It's and ruthless. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So
and that was kind of one of the points I was trying to make with your question earlier, Paul, and introducing what I've learned kind of from reading Ștefan's work. Part of this, right, you're trying to get this done to, in some ways, it's a show trial to show, look, West, look, Americans who we think are controlled by capitalist Jews, look, Soviets who we think are controlled by communist Jews, we're doing our part, right? And they're actually trying to do as little as possible. And the king's going to commute a lot of these sentences. But I think before we move on even further, I think we should talk a little bit more. I want to talk a little bit more about Macici, where Emanuel pointed out this. He becomes kind of the symbol of all this. In the Odessa massacre. This happens in 1941 in late October, following a big battle, where you have kind of 90,000 remaining casualties. About a third of those dead, and the rest of them, wounded. The army gets in. It's one of the few big cities that the Romanians take. The Germans don't allow them to take a lot of other ones. And soon after the occupation of the city, there is an act of partisan sabotage. There's an explosion of the 10th Infantry Division headquarters. It kills the commander and dozens of other Romanians and a few Germans, and who are also there's a small few battalions of Germans that have been involved. It's mostly a Romanian battle and occupation. Thereafter, you have these 2 men, Trestorianu. I always mess with Trestorianu. Yeah. He actually starts off the massacre. He ordering hangings immediately. And you have to remember that it's been about a week about a week or so since they took the city. So they've actually arrested a lot of people, primarily Jews. They've released some, but they still have these overflowing prisons. So when they decide to go for reprisals, and because of their anti-Semitic beliefs, they immediately start to attack, targeting mostly Jews as perpetrators of this, partisan attack. Macici comes in later, and he's the Second Corps commander, and he has basically the authority to go in there, and he's being told by superiors, Iacobici, who is the acting chief of staff at that point, who's already ordered more harsh reprisals. Ionescu starts getting involved, ordering more, and so Macici is there to basically, he goes in and tells this group of commanders, saying, "You're a bunch of scaredy cats. You haven't done enough," and he escalates the violence. And I want to maybe let Emanuel, since he's really looked into this, talk a little bit more about how these 2 men who are both involved in this massacre, resulting in depends. I mean, there's estimates about 20,000. I think it's more like 12. There's some that say 40,000, but it's a large massacre, very well known in a major city. As Diana pointed out, it's not really forgotten like some of these other ones. And smaller, even though some of them are, but Bogdanovka. Well, I want to talk a little bit more about that. But I'll let Emanuel kind of talk about these 2 men and how the dynamic in court, as who's responsible.
Right. Thanks, Grant. So I think when I usually talk about this trial, many times I actually frame it in terms of as the main focus of a blame game between these two generals. I mean, on the one hand, you have Macici and you have Tresteoreanu. Macici has had the most defense witnesses. Some of the people who defended him were also Jews who were brought in by Macici, people whom he knew, trying to say, hey, you know, like, I have Jewish friends, you know, they can vouch for me. But also Jakobic, whom Grant mentioned, who was actually the person who sent Macici there, who was the acting chief of staff, was kind of the role of his boss, who was also testifying for Macici, but he was actually testifying also for himself, because Jakobic could also have been accused in different trials. So he was trying to excuse him and excuse himself. And then you have Tresteoreanu, who puts the blame on Macici. Macici puts the blame on Tresteoreanu in the trial. So the entire trial, when it comes to these two people, are trying to accuse each other. Now we have a testimony in these trials. We have a major, Ovidiu Anca, who actually testified for Tresteoreanu. He was part of his defense. So when his turn comes up, he goes on and says that when Macici comes to Odessa, he takes Tresteoreanu aside and he tells them, "What the hell are you guys doing here? You're all a bunch of cowards. Odessa should have been torn upside down by now." And actually, Tresteoreanu, in his testimony, actually hints at the fact that he ordered those hangings and everything because that's how he thought that the army works. So basically, this is him kind of saying, you know, this was the army culture and all that. But Macici is very much more present in the trial than Tresteoreanu is. And we see from documentation that Tresteoreanu is actually regarded by many in the military as weak. And Macici had the same impression of him. So when he goes to Odessa, Macici immediately, so this is important, Macici goes to Odessa one day after the explosion takes place. Less than a day. I think that night, 23rd, is when Jakobic sends him there. And when he gets there and he doesn't see what he might have expected to see, like a complete, like, I don't know, thousands of people dead, he sees only a few hundred, he goes and says that this guy is not capable of military reprisals. So when Anca, who was major there, he wasn't that involved, he wasn't put on trial then, he was put on trial later, comes and says this, Macici does not deny it. And Tresteoreanu uses this to say, look, this is the guy who killed 25,000. That was the number, official number that was reached then. I didn't do anything. I was just there trying to, you know, do my stuff. And then this guy comes over. Macici, on the other hand, and this is also, and I wrote a paper on this, exactly on Macici's style of defense and on his entire trial. He actually claims that first, he was not involved in military reprisals because that was a political thing. But then he goes and contradicts himself, saying that military reprisals are a must in this kind of a situation. Why? Because, and I quote, "It was dictated to me by international law." So Macici claims that, you know, international law is the thing that makes us, soldiers, military, whatever, do this kind of stuff. Because in his mind, the Jews blew up the headquarters. So that's important. And also Macici says another thing, which is very important. He says that you do not blame soldiers for the actions of their officers, because what happens if a soldier doesn't follow orders? The entire army structure falls down. And actually, and this is a caveat to what was said before, very few soldiers are accused in these trials. These are trials targeted at officers, mostly, because the authorities in 45 and 46 tried to keep the army, the majority of the army, who were peasants, poor people, uneducated people, many of them, not all of them, but many of them, at least in the perception of the authorities, that army had to be kept clean. So you had to, you know, not indict the whole army that you probably needed afterwards. So in terms of, and I'm going to end with this on these two guys, in terms of this blame game, I think that it basically drives the entire narrative of what happened in Odessa. We know now what happened in Odessa, because when Macici gets there, I think around 20 to 25,000 people, Jews, die in various stages. Tresteoreanu is the one that starts. And I think that Traianus' role is much more important than some people give him credit for, because he actually induces this state of urgency to kill right immediately after. I mean, he gives the order before receiving any order.
Yeah. He like
The order
kind
comes on
of,
the
he shows up
23rd.
at the smoking ruins and says like, start hanging people like right then.
Yeah, and he claims that he knows what General Antonescu wants and what the army wants. It's kind of, I already know how the army works, so I'm gonna do this. And then Macic is, surprised. Is like, only this? That's it? And then and I think, and this is the last thing right now. Maybe we'll talk about this later. But the Odessa massacre actually ends on the 25th of October, so like 3 days after the explosion. But that leaves a lot of Jews in the city, which will be deported afterwards. And this is where all the other people in the trial and another trial come up. People who are, responsible for deportations and so on. Deportations, which I think in Odessa go up until the spring of 1942.
Yeah,
so it's
a
an entire process.
A lot of the Jews who survive in Odessa are thrown out in a first big wave, and a lot of them end up in Bogdanovka. And before I turn this over to Diana to talk a little bit more about the details of that, so some people had questions. You have some illustrations here, again from Scantie, the Spark, the official communist paper. These are kind of caricatures of some of the other people. Călătescu on the left, who was a governor of Bucovina, and then I can't remember the guy's name, but he was a camp commander at Tapinarca, which was an interesting camp because it's one of the few places where they actually got Jews who were communists, plus accused of communists or leftists. There was a core of actual communist Jews. They were deported there. It became very famous because of this connection, which when they're after the war, because they're communists and their Jewishness is played down, but their communistness is played up. We can see him eating a meal before these people being murdered, or Călătescu's with death. But I think we can talk a little bit about Diana, if she wants to talk about Bogdanovka. This is kind of where the massacre kind of moves to after Odessa.
Yeah, so it happens, the massacre itself started on December 1941, but I want to explain that like Bogdanovka, which is like right on the Bug River, it was a tiny village, and actually the place where the massacre happened, it was a site of a pig farm, like formerly a Soviet pig farm, where Soviets raised up to 11,000 pigs. We know this from Isopescu's messages, because in November 1941, Isopescu is writing messages to Bucharest saying that, look, I have here now over 11,000 Jews, 7 more are supposed to come from the vicinity, and you are sending to me 40,000 Jews. Please do not send them to me because it's going to be a catastrophe, because it's like cold. I cannot put them in the pigsties where used to be 11,000 pigs. I cannot put like now and keep 50-something Jews, he's saying. But like despite like several documents and telegrams that he sent, we do know that they arrive and it's already late and it's cold, and yeah, it happens what everybody assumed that will happen. Indeed, like people start dying en masse, and because of typhus as well. So what's happening, we do know that in Bucharest, the Bogdanovka is never mentioned, but there is this understanding that there is a crisis in southeastern Transnistria, and there are words that are said and protocoled, like in the minutes of the governmental meetings, that I don't care what's going to happen. I'm not going to wait for the Germans to take care of the situation, but the situation should be resolved. So, the authorities on the ground, they understand what it means. And actually, if you look into exactly what like Emanuel described now before, what is happening, we see an escalation of mass killing. So it's not that Bogdanovka is something that they, for the first time, they would start doing massacring people. They killed them in the summer of 1941 in the villages of Bessarabia and Bukovina. They had the order to kill those who were not able to keep pass already on the roads when being deported towards Transnistria. So it was this huge massacre in Odessa. So now, based on like what has happened in this like policy, so-called, towards Jews, and the sense of urgency and so-called security that was like put in the frame as like Jews being the threat to the security, including military security for the Romanian army, the only kind of solution found for this by the local Romanian authorities is this like mass killing. So they start, they basically, what they do, the brunt of this massacre is on the shoulders of local police. So we have all the police, like Ukrainian police, recruited by the Romanian gendarmes on the territory of Transnistria, but they also get in touch with the German administration, SS administration, that was in charge directly of the German towns, like, and Volksdeutsche communities. So they also recruit these like police from Volksdeutsche towns. So we have over 100, 110, 120 shooters that they all come here, start shooting the deportees from Bogdanovka. They take them in batches of 300-400 people, take them to a huge ravine. It was a natural ravine there, executing them. And they also start burning bodies. They stop as good Christians. They have their like Christmas, yes. They have a break.
New Year.
Yes, they celebrate and the New Year, and then in January start again and keep going for several more weeks. By January 12 or 13, the massacre is done. They have a Jewish labor brigade, which is about like 150 people who were supposed to do the dirty work, including like dragging the bodies and cleaning the territory, because the whole territory is a huge cemetery. And they're burning the bodies. All the villagers from the surrounding areas talk about like ash and smoke that's like spread around in the winter and in the snow. So it's like it's impossible to hide this kind of crime, and it will be like very difficult. They will have also some of the Jews who survived in the labor brigade. They will also be around and able to testify. And interestingly speaking about the soldiers, actually we do know at least one case when a gendarme, a Romanian gendarme from Bogdanovka, he felt uncomfortable with this kind of order. He wanted a written order. He wanted to like check up with his superiors, and when they understood that he and his like several subordinates were not on board with this, they were placed to another like site location. So it was not that impossible to say no. It's just like it wasn't that many of them challenged.
I think it's important because a lot of people, some people that I found did say no.
Yeah.
I mean, there are examples from this trial itself which actually say, like I said no, and from other trials. And I want to address. Go ahead. Sorry.
No, Emanuel. Yeah, exactly right. Yeah, Emanuel was one of them who also said no.
So you had people who, and nothing happened to them. I mean, mostly they were, frowned upon by some of their other soldiers and moved to a different area. This was usually like not to cause trouble, right? So you had them move. And I wanted to address very shortly regarding the trial, because I saw in the questions here from the audience, somebody was saying that what I mentioned, that were the absent accused deemed guilty until proven innocent? Yes and no. In terms, that one. In terms of our understanding today. So the question is good. However, they were deemed guilty in the initial trial if they didn't show up, because people who were, you have to understand the context. A lot of people were not present. Like in the Cluj People Tribunal, massive amount of people ran away. So this law was given to give power to the authorities to bring people in. So if you are not present, you were given the maximum sentence immediately. However, if you did show up, either because they caught you or because, you gave yourself up, you would be tried again, from scratch, without taking into account necessarily that you ran away. I don't know, you could have not been there for many reasons. And actually, there are cases of people who were put on trial after they were caught and just ran away. So they weren't necessarily deemed guilty, legally speaking, because of that principle being on its head. It was just a practical thing. And also another questions I saw with how the Jews were mentioned in the trial, because in the Soviet trials you had Soviet citizens, and in the Romanian trials you also had that, but not that much. So it wasn't like a standard. You have a lot of mentions of Jews because they couldn't avoid it, because a lot of how the discussion was done in this trial was talking about racial hatred. When you talk about racial hatred, you're talking about basically the modern understanding or that understanding of anti-Semitism. Now, this racial hatred was very weirdly framed, because when they framed it like that, one of the defense, Macici's defense actually was, well, I didn't display racial hatred. I have Jewish friends who testify here for me. I didn't kill anybody with my own hand. So this racial hatred thing was understood as, people who are like violent. I mean, the court didn't buy this, but it was still a matter of defense. So I think that's important to clarify.
I know I said I wasn't going to jump in much, but things you said, Emanuel, and things Diana said as well have kind of resonated with me. It seems, because we're going to be doing more war crimes coverage on World War II TV as we go over the next sort of 12 months or so, it seems the fatal flaw in some ways is that you're taking people with a criminal background, lawyers, judges, people like that, who maybe have been involved in trials where man A murdered man B with a knife. So it's he's either guilty or not guilty, and then it's a case of evidence. This is that complicated situation of knowing a crime has been committed, but you have people at the time of it who are willingly participating in it, people who are feeling uncomfortable about it at the time, people expressing concerns at the time, people refusing at the time to do it. And therefore, the problem is then establishing whose responsibility is it? We know the crime happened, we know the crime occurred, we know there are victims, but how do we work out who is the person that is overall responsible for it? And that seems to me the fatal flaw with the whole of the war crimes procedures in every country, is that that standard defense that you talked about earlier, Grant, is it wasn't me, it was someone else. I was following orders, and this is the complication of war crimes trials. And as I said, your average judge, your average prosecutor or defense lawyer just hasn't got the experience of dealing with something with this many layers of complication. Is that a fair comment, Grant? Do you think?
Well, I'll let Ştefan.
All the others, yes.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I just want to mention that I think this is one of the important difference between these trials, the People's Tribunal, and the early Soviet trials. Here, I mean, the Jewish victims and the Roma victims, also known as the Gypsies, they're mentioned on the names. In the Soviet trials, early Soviet trials, they're not mentioned. I mean, they just use this kind of generic euphemism, the Soviet peaceful citizens too. Here, so I think it's important because in this first Romanian war crime trials, we don't see yet this permeation. I think it's not yet full of kind of Soviet communist style Marxist jargon. It started to enter. I think Diana also mentioned something about that earlier, but it's not yet fully embedded within even the judiciary and the broader Romanian society. So they mention the victims directly here. Now, in terms of the criminal responsibility or not, many perpetrators here indeed they invoke superior's order, or that they did not really directly participate in the killings. So they were like so-called desk perpetrator. But this also resembles a lot with other trials that took place, including with Nazi perpetrators. I mean, we know even from books such as Christopher Browning, like Ordinary Men, even in that battalion, some of them, for example, say that we are not up to this, so they've been excused and not been punished, exactly reassigned to other types of job. Later on, they deny they specifically killed somebody, or they claim they shot over the heads of people, or they're soldiers, they had to do that, otherwise it would have been deadly punished. But historians could not uncover even one German who was punished by death for refusing to kill civilians, like Jewish civilians and others.
But I think there's some truth to what you're saying, though, Paul. That I think courts, they want to tell a story, and that'll be more powerful to make their case. And I think the public, especially, we talk about Macici becoming a symbol. I think that's part of it. And I think these also, I think these war crimes trials at the end of the war, I also think have an impact on our historiography or how we remember, because then we kind of make one person responsible.
Yeah.
Rather than realizing there's actually lots of levels and lots of people who initiate violence or who take the context and go farther and do things on their own initiative. So, whereas these war crimes trials want to draw, it all goes up to Macici, or it all goes to Tristianu, or it all goes to Isopescu, when in reality it's like the Germans are coming in talking to Isopescu. Isopescu has his ideas. There's local Ukrainian police with their motivations. The Volksdeutsche militiamen, it's much more difficult.
Yeah, but also, Paul, I think you point towards exactly. It's a very general issue. It's about war crimes, and it's it could extrapolate to any kind of context. It could be Romania, but many other countries. And so, of course, judges who don't know, who haven't been trained how to judge this type of crimes, it's very difficult. And even the whole concept, I think, especially by that time, it's not very clear. How do you deal when you have an order, And now the international law tried to deal more with it after World War II, and to bring more understanding of what is an illegal or legal order. And we know that even in contemporary Romania, most recently in the last decades, there have been workshops working with the army and also with the police forces, trying to help soldiers, officers to understand, what is that limit when you receive an order and you cross the border? What is legal? What's illegal? What is your responsibility as one individual, a soldier? That line where you're just supposed to do what you order, and here you cross the border and you commit a crime, even if you have an order.
I think
so. It's not that easy, and the problem is not solved even nowadays.
I think an important aspect here, with the court in this trial and later on, was that, the court had to deal with this. So I committed these deeds, whether directly killing or just organizing deportation, massacres, because I was part of the military hierarchy, so I had to obey the order. So the court decided, and this also resembled other courts who tried Nazi Holocaust perpetrators in other countries. It decided that you cannot invoke superior's order as a legitimate reason to excuse yourself and escape criminal responsibility if you understood that, the order that you're going to implement, it was obviously criminal. This was what court decided. This was also, I think, influenced by the Soviet doctrine from.
Well, I think we need to. We're kind of running low on time. We don't want to draw. I want to get to this aspect about sentences. This picture is an interesting one. The man with the X is Petru Groza. So he is not a communist. He was the interwar politician of the Plowman's Front, kind of a agrarian socialist group. But he kind of throws in, and he becomes prime minister. So of this government, he's working a lot with the other left wing parties, and especially the Communist Party. And you see that sentence that says, through the harsh punishment of war criminals, we assure peace and prosperity for our country, and also do justice. This is once again one of these taglines from Scantie during the trial. Macici, he was sentenced to death, but commuted to life in prison. Same with Tristianu, Isopescu as well. Isopescu and Macici die in prison a couple years later. Ionescu, Tristianu actually gets out. There's an amnesty 10 years later.
There are a bunch of amnesties, yeah.
Yeah, a bunch more for all of them. And then Ionescu gets sentenced to life in prison. He's tried again, given 20 years. He's also later released in 1964 and goes on. But just to kind of throw it out to the group, how is the Groza government, as we have him on the picture, how do they see this war crimes trial? Do they see it as a success, as this kind of Stalinist show trial?
I think it was very complicated in terms of even of perception. You had people in the Council of Ministers right before the trials who talked about, okay, guys, what is collaboration? They had no idea. I don't think they viewed it as a show trial at all. I think that even terminology like Lucrețiu Pătrășcanu who was Minister of Justice during this period, was a party communist member. He actually talked about political trials, and what he says that these people have political responsibility in terms of who they are. So it was a back and forth, even in terms of understanding. I don't think it was very clear even then, because like Diana mentioned, and like it was mentioned before, you had this kind of continuity from before. So not everything was Soviet. And I argue in one of my articles too that you had both of these influences in different ways. I think it was complicated for them as well.
I want to say that, I mean, the Groza trial, I mean, you can talk about like the broader goals, like political, social goals of this. I mean, in addition to kind of fulfilling the international obligation of the Armistice Agreement. So basically, on one hand, I think the pro-communist coalition, they wanted to increase their legitimacy in the country, in Romania. They wanted to present themselves as promoter of justice, as the main resistors against fascists and Nazis, and now punishing former fascists and Nazis, and to increase their political legitimacy. I mean, in terms of like practical results of these trials organized by the People's Tribunal, I think the Groza government, they were unhappy with the results. Again, I mean, kind of sum up, out of those investigating, like more than 3,000 something, a third were indicted. Out of those 1,200 something indicted, 1/4 was acquitted, and others sentenced to different prison times. The Soviets were not happy with that. And just to mention about the Soviet interference in these trials, because I mean, this was like one of the main accusations of those who tried to dismiss the trials, saying that this is show trials. I mean, we talked about that. The Soviet trials, the Soviet did have a role in terms of, I mean, sometimes they submitted lists with potential war criminals to be arrested. Sometimes they arrested war criminals. Sometimes they gave their opinion about the verdicts, the harsh verdicts. I mean, was mentioned earlier that many of the people who were sentenced in this trial, the first trial, were sentenced to death, and then these punishments were commuted to life imprisonment. The communist members of, I mean, the Groza government, they went to the Soviet embassy and they asked their opinion. So the Soviet advised them to commute this in order to kind of appease the population, not to trigger some sort of like popular unrest in support of these officers, that the public will see that this pro-Groza government is killing our officers, our kind of war heroes. But also the Soviets, I just want to say that they're responsible for some of the inefficiency of these trials. Why? Because, for example, sometimes the Soviets intervene, and other Groza officials intervene to release specific individuals that were indicted or investigated as war criminals. Even Petru Groza, the pro-communist prime minister, he intervened several times for the release of some of those suspects of war crimes. The Soviets also neglect, or it's not clear to me, to submit evidence about the crimes perpetrated on Soviet territory now. I mean, as Diana mentioned, like in Northern Bukovina, Transnistria, or Bessarabia, now they're part of Soviet Union. So they refused the request, or like they did not act on the request from the People's Tribunal to send them evidence, I mean, about the crimes perpetrated on those territories. So I think this is also an important aspect to talk about.
And Grant, I think we should just kind of round off now with a little bit of kind of legacy, the individual panelists' kind of idea of how this sits in popular memory today, either in where they live now or Romania or the world in general. So should we do a kind of a final round of sort of summing things up? Folks who...
So I just want to briefly, so during the communist era, these, you have trials in the 40s and 50s, but then thereafter, the appetite for these kind of trials end.
Yeah.
And this trial specifically kind of becomes more obscure. They don't want to bring up these ideas, especially if you have Ceausescu take over and has this nationalist communism. This becomes embarrassing. And some of these individuals are somewhat rehabilitated, even in the late 1980s, especially as they're glorifying the last part of the war. In post-1989, this goes crazy because you have fall of communism. So all these people are definitely all of a sudden are anti-communist martyrs. In the middle there, you have a card for a special stamp put out by the National Military Museum of Macici celebrating him. And he had fought with he was commanded the Romanian First Army after they switched sides and fought into Hungary before his arrest in February, and then being sent back to Bucharest for eventual trial. So these are people that and Ionescu, you see this bust, they're trying to rehabilitate him. And, that this bust has now fortunately been taken down because of Romania recognizing the role of the regime in 2004. But you still have people trying this. Macic's son, I think he's in Canada now, as recently as 2020, was doing legal proceedings. And we're not just talking about, kind of generally, let's talk up these people, although this is part of it. But his son enacted legal efforts to try to overturn his father's conviction as a war criminal. There's also other outrageous rehabilitations that occur in the 1990s or are trying to do now. And so overall, I think there's this idea, and I think most of the panelists would kind of agree with me, that there's a sense that these are all Stalinist show trials, and all these men were unjustly imprisoned who died as martyrs in communist prisons, or the rest.
Yeah, I agree. If I may jump in, I think, and this is a very complicated topic, especially because we tend to view these trials through the means of viewing trials today, as a lot of people look at them as if those were happening today, and they did not. They happened in a very, very complicated context. And these outrageous rehabilitations that Grant mentioned are actually more than an exception, are actually the norm in how these people view trials. I mean, I had discussions with university professors who told me that, there was something fishy about these trials. I mean, it depends what you understand about fishy. If you're trying to define them as you would today, obviously that would not work. The point is, and I think this is very important, is that a lot of people still see these trials as trials or very, very politicized trials, also because of the way that we are, as a society, as Romanian society, are trained to see the communist period today. And much of us are conditioned to see it as the ultimate evil. So anything that has to come remotely close to it must be negative. And this has a lot to do with public memory, so not so much with history. And obviously, it's a very complicated scene. But I think this is important to understand. And I think a lot of viewers have to remember this, is that when it comes to memory, Romanian public memory, as in other parts of Eastern and Central Europe, is very much politicized now, but when talking about past events. So these trials are very much seen as communist trials. And this was one of the main things that I said. These are not communist trials. They're post-war trials dealing with war crimes and others in a very complicated context. And what Grant said regarding Macici, and I think that's important from a legal perspective, is that his family petitioned the Romanian court to basically say that he was politically convicted and so on. And the Romanian Supreme Court gave a final decision saying that Macici cannot be considered a victim of communism, because he was put on trial for acts or for things that happened during the war, so before the communist state took over. So, and that's the final decision. And I think that's important because it will inform other possible rehabilitation process. So even from a legal perspective, you now have a final decision of a Romanian Supreme Court that says that these trials can and should be considered acts of justice, even from a legal perspective. I'm not talking about the whole discussion about political justice and what that means. I think that's important. And I'm going to end with saying that, yes, in the 90s, you had 2, I think, or 3, I don't remember exactly, perpetrators who were rehabilitated by the courts, by the 90s Supreme Courts. That does not happen today, because the way the law understood that, I mean, generally the courts have understood that these trials can be taken as acts of justice. And I think that's exactly what the legal system did. And I think that's our job as historians to also show from a historical point of view.
Diana, maybe do you have one last thing? Is there anything about the context of how these are remembered in Moldova, across the border, in a country that's Romanian speaking, has a lot of identity with Romania, but also has these minorities and a very different...
No, I wouldn't say that there is much attention specifically to the Romanian post-war trials, but like everything that Emanuel mentioned before, especially in context of attitude towards communist history and communist trials or communist everything is like it's an exactly mirroring image. And we do deal with a lot of post-war trials on the territory of nowadays Moldova, and it's exactly the same attitude from both like the broader audience, but also from the side of historians that really try to oppose. There is a clear reluctance to see those trials as legitimate, and they are refuted, and the people are considered victims, although it's very clear if you study the documentation that those were perpetrators put on trial because they took direct and clear part in executions, in persecution, abuse of Jews or like other individuals, and so they were put on trial for individual crimes. But yeah, the attitude towards communism, in this case, it's a convenient filter that allows people to just like deny from the very beginning, even without looking into the details of a case, of a trial, by saying like, oh, no, let's not go into like looking into this because like, yeah, they were done by the communist regime. End of story kind of attitude.
Yeah. Ştefan?
Yes, thank you. I just want to say two lines about this kind of post-99, post-communist rehabilitation of these war criminals and this kind of denying the Holocaust. I just want to mention like maybe somehow some positive aspects that starting from 2000 is something part of this process of Romania trying to join the European Union and NATO. There was, I think, there were some positive developments. What I see is positive. I mean, of course, others might not see them in that way, in the sense that I think local political and judicial elites kind of understood that they have to deal with this past of the country. I mean, with this like crimes, and they have to address them kind of full head somehow in order to make some steps towards like political integration of the country in EU and NATO. For example, I just mentioned that as a result of that, Romania established the Elie Wiesel International Commission to study the Holocaust in Romania, accepted its final report, issued apologies to the victims, established the Elie Wiesel Institute, Holocaust Institute in Romania, adopted Holocaust education programs, some textbooks, and also I think an important law that was changed a little bit later on, banning the cult of war criminals, fascist, racist, and xenophobic acts. The only problem with this law that was not so much enforced until recently. I think it's a big problem. So this law that banned the cult of fascists, war criminals, was not so effectively enforced by the judiciary so far. I think maybe recently, faced with kind of like rise of right-wing politics in Romania, the judicial authority might be more willing to address this issue. But yeah, the political scene in Romania is also pretty troubled currently, and yeah.
Well, I mean, the verdict is out from the sidebar, and the verdict has been that we need to bring you guys back. That we may not have sorted out the problem of war crimes in World War II from Romania, but we have sorted out the fact that people like what you've got to say about it. So that Paul Woodad to World War II TV has declared that you are found guilty of being very interesting. So we're going to invite you back. So that we can be certain about. But what you've done collectively is remind me that this is going to be a very fantastic and fabulous series where we start getting into the war crimes, because it's very complicated. And my kind of closing remarks are, just because someone isn't convicted of war crimes doesn't mean they're not guilty of war crimes. Someone who is convicted of a crime and that sentence commuted doesn't mean they're guilty, doesn't mean they're not guilty. And someone who is declared not guilty doesn't mean they're innocent. It means they have not been declared guilty. And I think some of those fundamentals are often forgotten, even with, the modern convictions of celebrities over things. Being found not guilty doesn't mean innocent. It means being found not guilty. And I think even us, not within the legal profession, need to be minded of those basics. So Grant, I will leave it with you to say, if you want to do a closing remark, but basically we're going to invite you all back to continue this, because I don't think we've done more than scratch the surface. So your closing remarks, please, Ms. Grant.
Well, I just want to thank you for having us on, and thank my fellow participants. And I'm really grateful to represent the Society for Romanian Studies and our working group about the Holocaust and the Second World War. And I just want to, hopefully, any of you who are interested in this, all of our books are online, are available. You can find them online. and all of our research, and continue to look into this and other aspects of the Second World War.
Yeah, brilliant. Well, we'll leave things there. So, folks, enjoy your weekend. It's going to give me a lot to think about over the weekend. This conversation, as all of the discussions I've had this week. So, more content coming your way next week. Enjoy wherever you are in the world, commemorating the end of the Second World War in Europe. That's coming up next week. But don't forget, there was a lot more fighting out in the Pacific and Southeast Asia. But in the meantime, thanks to my panelists. Thanks to everybody for your questions. We didn't get to all of them, but we'll do that another time. Thanks for Grant for organizing it. I will see you all after the weekend. Cheers, everybody. Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye for inviting us. Bye.